We are touching down on planet Volkus today. It's about time I got some of this terrain out of the way. I've been kind of using the regular grey terrain for Volkus from the Hivestorm box set for a while. So I think without further ado, let's paint some terrain. I'm starting off by priming all of the pieces, but instead of my usual airbrushing prime, I'm actually using the Acryl primer. These are spray cans, and because of the sheer amount of terrain, I figured this would probably be the easiest way to spray it all up. So I've started off the same way I usually do, a black, followed by a little bit of a grey, and then a white highlight from above. And you can see I've got that same kind of zenithal effect I was hoping to achieve, but with the spray can instead. And afterwards you can kind of see I've got this nice gradient going on. I could have gone a little bit further down with the grey, but overall I'm pretty happy with the gradient. And then rather than just adding paint straight onto this primer, I'm going to start by shading the whole thing. This is a little bit extreme, maybe even a little bit wasteful for the shade. You might be able to find a cheaper oil or a shade that you can use rather than using the Games Workshop stuff, but this has been sitting on my shelf for a while. I decided to just use it all up on this terrain. And so I mixed roughly 50% of the Lahmian medium to 50% of the Agrax Earthshade, and I'm just doing an all-round coat on pretty much all of the terrain apart from the statue. I'm making sure that this whole thing just gets a nice bath in this wash. And what this is going to do is it's going to create these kind of grimy, dusty shadows without me having to paint all this in afterwards. This gives us a really nice base to work off of. So here I'm using some Runic Grey and some Speedpaint Medium, again roughly 50-50 mix, and I'm applying this to all of the flat horizontal platforms. This gives a really nice kind of steel appearance. And you can see that the parchment paper underneath does a really good job of keeping the desk tidy. Now that that's dry, I'm looking at the terrain and I'm deciding which areas I want to do in a gold and which areas I want to do in a different color. I've decided to do all of the wall sections in this rust gray, and I'm using a makeup brush for this because they're really good at creating a nice kind of soft gradient, so you don't get as much like brush marks in there. And the bonus of them being quite cheap as well, so you can really kind of hammer the brushes. I'm taking care not to get it on the areas that I want in the gold, but for right now, it's okay if there's a little bit of overspray. And then for the gold sections, I'm starting off with a base coat of Pallid bone. And this is a speed paint, so I'm just letting it do its work on these kind of riveted areas. This seems kind of counterintuitive to paint the gold with an undercoat, but this is kind of insurance in case I miss anything with the gold paint because it is quite thin. So by having this contrast underneath kind of ensures that I don't have any areas of kind of patchiness. And for the gold itself, I'm using Elven gold. And again, I'm just going back over those areas now that that speed paint has dried. You can see it's quite streaky and patchy. I don't want to do too many coats because I really want this whole thing to be done very quickly. There's a lot of terrain to paint. And so I'm just doing a very, very quick coat of this Elven gold. And it doesn't matter if it's streaky or patchy because that Pallid bone underneath will kind of fill in the gaps. You can see that this is a really quick and easy way of laying down some metallic paints without having to do several coats. I'm also just taking my time and getting some areas of trim as well, like these skulls. And there is a lot of detail in these terrains. This is kind of Games Workshop's specialty, so I'm just making sure that I hit some of these areas to really help these details pop. For the first stage in the weathering, I'm actually using a Mojave white, and I'm taking an old sponge and just dabbing on some texture. This really helps to sell the idea that this is kind of weathered or aged, and also that it kind of breaks up a lot of these flatter areas of just that rust grey. the more that we layer on to this terrain, the more believable it becomes, the more livable it looks. So I'm just taking this sponge and dabbing on some black and Mojave white just onto these areas to kind of help sell the idea that this is a battle damaged environment. And again, the trick with terrain is layering. Just keep layering on your weathering passes, just keep layering on those details. You don't have to pick out everything. You can kind of see I've missed a lot of the intricate stuff. And partly the reason is because you could kind of drive yourself mad painting all this, and the other reason is that you don't want to distract too much from the miniatures on the table as well. This is meant to be a complementary piece to those showcase miniatures. Here I'm just dry brushing on some speed metal to help tarnish some of that gold, and again cover up some of those streaks and patches. The other thing I'm keeping my eye on as well is the overall value. So I'm trying to make sure that the gold areas still pop against those blues, but they're not kind of the same tone. I don't want it to just appear as one shade after all said and done. So I'm just making sure that some of my highlighted areas are just a little bit brighter than the overall kind of mid-tone of the walls and the backgrounds. I'm using some plate mail metal to dry brush all of the doors and the windows. This is to kind of help to just distinguish them just a little bit from the rest of the terrain. You could also use like a lead belcher here if you wanted it a little darker over paint, but I wanted to highlight some of the gameplay reasons and also just to kind of break it out from the rest of the colors. Next up, I'm using some decayed metal, and I've decided to try something different with these boilers. I want to kind of convey that these are old and rusted, just like all the rest of the terrain, so this is kind of an undercoat initially, and then I'm going to try something new on top, and we'll see if it works. I'm not too worried about the coverage. Again, this is just a very quick kind of metallic underneath because we're going to be layering. This heavy chipping acrylic fluid has been sitting on my desk for a while, and I decided to give it a go. So the idea is that you do your undercoat and then you run this through your airbrush on top and let that dry, and then the next layer that you paint on top can be chipped away, revealing the underneath layer. And so for now I'm just going to let that dry and move on to the next color, which is an acrylic ink, and I'm still going to run this through the airbrush and just gently catch the edges to kind of imply a scorched kind of rock or wall texture. This just really helps kind of boost those contrasting colors again and gives me a little bit more value in the overall piece. The next thing I want to do is use some burnt umber pigment, and with that same dry brush just start dabbing this onto the bottom sections of all of the terrain. And again, this is just adding more of that layering, more of those colors, just to help kind of sell this as a really dusty, debris-ridden environment. I'm looking for as many of these little storytelling moments in the terrain as I can find, because that really sells the overall appearance. Now that the chipping fluid is dry, I'm adding the next coat of Mephiston Red and just letting that set on there. As with everything on this terrain so far, I'm going for the quickest, almost cheapest methods I can do to paint the whole thing in a very, very small amount of time. So I'm just adding these layers very quick. I'm not looking for complete coverage. I just want to make sure that it's basically red. And then I'm going to take an old dry brush here and really kind of scrape off that top layer. I damped the brush just a little bit to help shift some of that paint once it was dry. And you can see it is pulling up the top layer, but not the brass texture underneath. You can also use a damp paper towel to help really kind of push those edges a little bit more. And there you can see the difference. It works quite well. I don't know if it's like the best method to kind of weather, but it's definitely like an interesting thing, and I just wanted to try it out. Once that's dry, I'm adding just another quick layer of Agrax Earthshade to help bring in some of those shadows again. I think overall I'm happy with the way the chipping worked, but I think I picked two very similar tones, so you can't really see the amount of detail and the amount of paint that's been chipped away, because the copper is already kind of a red and the boiler's already kind of a red. For the crates here, I'm just using that plate mail metal as an undercoat, and I'm going to do the chipping method again on these. I'm also picking out just a couple details on some of the smaller scatter terrain pieces, like the rebar here. Again, I'm not looking to highlight everything, just pick out some of these key areas that I think could benefit from a color change. Next up, I'm just injecting a little bit of brown. This is Scrag Brown. I've watered it right the way down for almost a rust kind of color, and just dabbing this on with an old brush just to help kind of add some areas of interest and break up some of this blue. And you can see it adds just a little bit more dimension to the colors. It kind of enhances some of the blues and just adds some areas of interest for the eye. Going back to those crates, I'm using Castellan Green. So now that the chipping fluid has dried on there, I'm adding a layer of the Castellan Green, and I'm going to be using black for the other crate that's the different shape. Again, not looking for full coverage, just to kind of get a color on there so that I can wipe off and add some damage to these. And so now that they're dry, I'm just following the same steps as I did for the boilers. This worked a lot better. You can see the actual chips and the flakes coming off, and that's because the green is a lot darker than the silver underneath, and that really helps to kind of pop that weathering. For the details on the crates, I'm still using that Elven Gold just to highlight some of these crests here. I'm trying to stay within the range of the same colors. I'm not trying to use too many bright or crazy colors, because I want the overall terrain to have a kind of muted feel. Next up, I am going to be using some enamel paints. So this is Dark Streaking Grime and some Odorless Thinners. You have to wash your brushes in the Odorless Thinner. Water won't wash the brush after you're done. And so using that Odorless Thinner, I'm just adding some of these streaks to some of the more metallic areas, just to really imply that this is oily or it's been rained on. And again, this is another excuse to kind of add some of that storytelling back into the terrain. There's so much detail and broken lights and broken panels and things, and I really want to just highlight some of these areas more without having to paint every single thing. So here I'm just pulling the brush downward to kind of create a streak, and then if it's just a little bit too thick, I'll take some of that Odorless Thinner and then just use that to help kind of fade those edges and kind of almost erase some of those thicker lines. I was tempted to highlight some of these lighting features, but I decided to hit these with some of that enamel, and this just helps kind of create the impression that the electricity has gone off and they're just dull bulbs by this point. And you can see just by focusing on certain areas really does pull attention to those moments. I'm just working my way around using that Odorless Spirit to just help feather the edges on some of these streaks. For any of the areas of rocks or terrain, I'm using Coelia Greenshade to help kind of shade these down to match the matte a little bit closer, the one that came with the Hivestorm. And this is also the same technique I used in my Stingwings and Aquilon video. And if you're interested in seeing either of those, I recommend checking them out after this one. I'll also leave a link to it here. I'm going to be using the Fang just to help dry brush some of these rocks back into their color again. You can also use some of that rust grey from earlier. And then I'm going to give this a final dry brush of some white. And this is just a very, very gentle dry brush. I'm not leaning too heavy on the brush, just letting it catch some of the corners just to help add that extra highlight. I want to do something special for this open boiler, so I'm mixing together some Milliput, and I'm going to be using this to kind of fill in most of the boiler. I'm going to be trying to create almost like a slime or a sludge in there, and so rather than use up a whole bunch of paint, I'm just going to fill it up halfway with some of the Milliput. And so once that putty is mixed together, I'm just kind of squishing it down with my thumb and making sure I get a fairly smooth surface so that I can paint on top. And then for this, I'm going to be using Nurgle's Rot. This is a kind of a green paint with a gloss in it as well to kind of get that really slimy appearance. And then I'm going to be moving on to the statue. So this is the statue that came with Blood and Zeal, and I really want this to be a nice focal point for all of the terrain. And so this is the Pallid bone again. I'm working off of the Zenithal I've got underneath. I'm quite happy with the way that the spray cans got that Zenithal. You can dry brush in some of the Zenithal if you sprayed it too dark, but I'm just applying that speed paint first and really letting that contrasting paint work its magic. So it's kind of a bone sandy texture on the whiter areas, and in the darker areas it's a much more darker brown. You can see as we get further up the statue where the white hit it more, we're starting to get more of that sandy texture, especially around the face and the wings. And the nice thing about this is it does kind of half the work for you, so you don't have to paint in that gradient or those shadows. You've already got your shadows and your midtones already painted. It wouldn't be one of my projects without some deck tan. You can also use that Mojave white from earlier as well. But I'm using this to dry brush back on some of those areas of detail and just raise the overall value of the statue up a notch. I'm just focusing on the upturned areas for this dry brush, so the knee and the feet, the sword for example. I just want to make sure that some of these upturned areas are really catching the light. On the wings, I'm using almost a circular motion just to kind of help catch some of those feathers and some of those details. And I'm not going too far down on the wings, I'm just kind of localizing it to just the top area of those wings. And then I've decided just to hit a small amount of dry brush with the white. So just letting that catch some of those smaller edges, especially around the more deck tan areas. Like the very tip of the wings here and the tip of the knee. And then I've decided to add an accent color, so I'm using that Elven Gold. This time I'm not using an undercoat, I'm just going to apply it straight out because I'm planning on adding a wash to this. So I'm just taking my time, working my way around. You can see those areas that I've left with the same base coat, just so that I can get them with this gold and really focus on that nice accent punch. So here I'm using some Seraphim Sepia. You could of course use the Agrax Earthshade from before, but I wanted to add a warmer shade to all these gold areas. And this just really helps to kind of keep the whole statue in the warm color spectrum. For the torch, I've decided to add a very simple flame effect using some fluorescent paints. You could use really any fluorescent yellow. This is just one that came with my airbrush. So I'm just applying this, and I should have really undercoated the flame in white first. I got a little bit too hesitant. So this took a few more coats than what I was used to. But eventually I kind of worked the effect until I'm happy with it. Just using that fluorescent orange and that fluorescent yellow, blending them together on the model, keeping the paints wet. And then here I'm using some titanium white ink just to kind of fill in those gaps on the torch. You could use a watered down bold titanium white if you wanted to as well. And now I'm kind of blending all three of those colors together just to help really sell the idea that this is a really white hot flame in this torch. Finally, I'm just adding a little bit of a smoke texture to the tip of the flames themselves using some neutral gray, just dry brushing on there. And then followed by just a very, very small amount of black. And because we've got these dark colors at the very tips of the flames, it really does sell the idea that this is getting much, much brighter towards the base of the flame. And going back in with the Elven Gold and finally painting up those small ridges on this sconce. Taking extra care not to get it into the flame itself. And then I decided to add just a little bit of scorching to those areas. So this is just some of that black, just a very, very small amount, almost a dry brush, but not quite. Very, very light pressure, just to kind of add some contrast to the torch itself. I'm finishing out the gold sections with a dry brush of speed metal. This just really helps sell the tarnished and weathered look. It also helps to take out the intensity of that gold as well. For the candles, Mephiston Red again. Just a very simple base coat here. It was pretty difficult to get around the back without kind of getting some paint overspill, so I wasn't too bothered about getting an exact paint job. And then I used some of that fluorescent orange and just added it to the tip of the candles. Because these are going to be lit, it kind of implies that the light is glowing through the wax itself, and also just adds a nice little highlight to them. This time around I am adding a white undercoat. I should have on the torch, but here I'm just adding a quick white undercoat. This really helps to punch up those fluorescent paints. And then some fluorescent yellow on top, and I'm just making sure that that's kind of localized to the top part of the flame so that the white is at the base of the candle. Lastly, I'm just doing some simple sponging with some black. This just helps break up some of these colors and just adds to the overall weathering look. And there we have it, some Volkus terrain finally painted. This has been on my wish list for a very long time, and I'm really happy with the way it turned out. Like I said before, the whole thing about terrain is storytelling and overall tone. You don't want it to detract from the miniatures. Thank you so much for making it this far in the video. A huge thank you to my YouTube members and my Patreon. Be sure to check it out. I'll leave a link to it down below. It will help out the channel, and also you'll get some great goodies and extras. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.